Stay in there. It looked very moody and pretty spooky in there. And Paul said, well, it's not built to come out. It's going to look like a teepee walking around, you know. And Roger, you know, prevailed. He said, I want to see it. And he said, also, I want it to die and fall over. And Paul said, it can't die and fall over because it's going to look like a teepee falling over, you know. And he said, well, I still want that. Then the people started howling and laughing, and we just got up and left because Paul said, I don't really need to see this, you know.
The movies may not have been cinematic masterpieces, but with every new release, Sam and Jim continued to build up their little company brick by brick. They were making up the rules as they went along, and everyone was having the time of their lives.
When the company was first going, Jim's wife Sylvia was the bookkeeper. Sam's wife Hilda was fixing sandwiches for the wrap parties and the crew. Sam was out there with his cigar hustling up new things, and Jim was finessing agents and actresses and actors. I mean, talk about a family unit.
Like old-time hucksters, Sam and Jim began peddling their wares from town to town. They'd run a print for a week in one movie house, then hustle it on to the next and the next until the prints literally fell apart. It was old-fashioned barnstorming. The two of them delighted in finding different ways to seduce the young audiences. And to do it, they rolled out some of the most outrageous campaigns in motion picture history.
We had to sell our pictures a certain way. We didn't have the biggest female and the biggest male star to put there. We had to sell something else. We had to sell exploitation.
Her brain kept alive by experimental science, by a man whose abnormal passions inspired him to try the impossible.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
His mad ambitions and desires threaten every woman possessing an attractive body. Girls whose measurements make them beauty contest participants. Professional figure models such as this. All are prey to his distorted desires.
We've got to stop him.
Even though these pictures were made sometimes in 5 days, and they weren't cinematically, shall we say, too sophisticated, the trailers for the movies made the pictures look like they were offering forbidden thrills that you couldn't get from the other pictures.
Find the breeding place of these globs of destruction. See the brain eaters.
Exploitation was the name of the game, and while Sam cut the deals, Jim began cooking up a barrage of promotional campaigns, enticing teenagers with lurid trailers and advertising that often had little to do with the movies themselves. It was a technique they liked to call the C factor.
See the world ended by atomic fury.
See what happened to the teenage stool pigeon when the gang got hold of her.
See the horrible mutant who seeks a mate.
At AIP, a 4C ad was a must-see picture.
Movie trailers were great fun. They were meant to bring the people in, titillate that interest, and they did. And Jim loved doing those. That was just fun for him. It was as much fun as creating the movie posters or the copy lines on the movie posters. He truly did enjoy that aspect of the business.
To help create the posters, Jim Nicholson hired a hotshot young art director named Al Kalis.
We were selling a product that you can't smell, you can't feel, you can't touch it, and after you put your money down, we won't give it back. Now that's an almost impossible thing to sell. So the poster had to contain the fantasy and the excitement that I got to see it now. And you better want to see it now because it was only in town for 5 days and almost never stayed over.
It's no canard that some of the posters really are better than the movies, because they are just fabulous pieces of art.
Kalis's posters became collector's items. They were brash, racy, and sometimes they promoted movies that hadn't even been made.
There was a period of time where Jim made the connection that we were booking films by sending out either press books or sending out glossies, and theaters were booking them. So he got this bright idea one day, why don't we make up a movie campaign of a picture we haven't made yet and see if anybody will book it? And in a number of instances they did. As a matter of fact, I went to a couple of conventions were theater owners who always swore that if they could have put sprocket holes on the campaign, they'd have made more money. The biggest problem was thinking up titles, and it was Jim who taught me this. The title on an exploitation film is everything. When the right title comes out of somebody's mouth, everybody knows it.
Jim Nicholson was the best title man I've ever known. He could go to sleep at night, and in the morning he'd come in, he'd say, "Sam," he said, "listen to this title." And I would listen to him say, "The Beast with a Million Eyes." You could just feel the money pouring in.
The money was pouring in, but AIP was constantly having to devise new methods to compete with Hollywood's big guns. And when the major studios began releasing their films in CinemaScope and Panavision, Sam and Jim decided to create a few technologies of their own.
They used to have a process called Superama, and they would plaster this all over the posters, and it would say, "Filmed in Superama, cannot be seen on TV." And when you actually examine Superama, it was absolutely nothing. It was a normal film frame with no anamorphics, no tricks. It was just an advertising gimmick. But they were shameless, and you had to love it.
There was one picture in Cinemagic. It was called The Angry Red Planet, and you were supposed to actually feel the canyons of Mars, and they were promising things that they haven't done in movies yet today with all their special effects.
Feel the fire-hot breath of a 40-foot monster as it reaches for you in Cinemagic.
You are about to see a preview of the most fantastic advance ever to be made in the history of motion picture entertainment, called Hypnovista. It is a psychological technique whereby you, seated in the auditorium, actually become part of the action you see on the screen.
Hypnovista, Superama, Cinemagic, all fantastic cinematic breakthroughs that were complete AIP fabrications with not an ounce of truth behind them.
I think, my God, these are the equivalent of cinematic muggings. I mean, they might as well have taken me out into the back alley before I got into the theater and stolen the quarter out of my hand.
The movies might have been cheap, the plot lines preposterous, and the ad campaigns huge exaggerations. But to the amazement of almost everyone in Hollywood, AIP, with its cast of unknown actors and questionable scripts, had successfully created a small but legitimate film company. And it was a success story that the majors could no longer afford to ignore.
When newspapers refused to run ads for AIP's bikini movies, Arkoff wrote a heated letter to the publishers claiming modern youth will never realize the function of the belly button. We'll be back with more on AMC's Hollywood Lives and Legends. Now back to more on AMC's Hollywood Lives and Legends.
Well, the major studios knew they couldn't match us in cost. But whatever we did, they copied, they aped, using the same kind of titles and so on and so forth. So we had to look for another angle. As a matter of fact, there are many times during the reign, if you can call it that, of AIP, that we had to change our format and the type of pictures we were making.
As the 60s began, the dark clouds hanging over Hollywood started to drift away. The movie industry had been re-energized by the teenage audience, and while nobody in town gave them any credit for it, Sam and Jim had played a crucial role in putting the business back on its feet. But they'd awakened a sleeping giant. The majors began flooding the market with cheap monster movies of their own, while at the same time producing big-budget epics like Spartacus and Ben-Hur, which Sam and Jim could never afford to make. The skeptics figured Arkoff and Nicholson would be out of business by the end of 1960. But Sam and Jim had another idea.
The thing that kept AIP alive all the years is that they kept reinventing themselves. When something didn't work anymore, they looked around for something else to take its place. And they were quite successful at that. I don't think there was ever much downtime for them. As soon as they saw it wasn't working, they had a new plan.
They heard about Italian strongman movies that were filling theaters all across Europe. So they took a trip to Rome and came back with a couple of souvenirs.
They started buying foreign films because they could buy a film cheaper than they could make it.
Thanks to its spectacular locations and cheap labor, the Italian movie industry was small but thriving, churning out dozens of sword and sandal movies each year. Sam and Jim put up $20,000 and bought 2 of these movies. Their plan? To dub them into English and market them as if they were Ben-Hur.
Please, Goliath, save me.
The fact that the mouths didn't always fit the words never seemed to bother anyone.
I will free Julia and all of the others, and those responsible will pay for their crimes.
Jim mostly would get in the cutting room with us and said, okay,